Language is an essential tool when we're working together. It's the tool that we use to communicate with each other, and it's a fundamental tool for us to collaborate together. Now, when we have multicultural teams, the language that we use might also be the source of some misunderstandings or eventually even some tensions or some conflicts. And that's what we're talking about today. We're going to be talking about how is it that language influences the work of a multicultural team, and what are the things that you as a leader need to be paying attention when you have a multicultural team. If this is your first time here, welcome aboard the Leadership Boat. So in terms of language and the way that they influence the work of a team that is composed of people who come from different cultures, who come from different countries and from completely different backgrounds, the language can have certain impacts, and there are three main aspects that we're going to be covering today. The first one is the structure of the language or the grammar. Now, that might sound a bit strange or maybe even like borderline boring if you didn't really like languages when you were at school, but this is actually one of the things that oftentimes is one of the key points that is visible in terms of language when you have a multicultural team. So what happens sometimes, not all the time and not to everyone, but you will see this happening a lot of times, is that people who come from different countries and from different cultures, they might be using English to communicate in a professional setting. And English might be their second language. So sometimes you will have people who are using English to communicate, however they use English with the grammar of their native language. And different languages have very different grammars, and therefore they have very different structures in the sentences. Some people might have gotten used to speak English, and maybe in a conversation that comes across fluently and you can understand each other just fine. And maybe you will see this in writing, that maybe the structure is a bit different in how they write. And that is because they might be thinking in their original language. So for example, I'm originally from Portugal, and right now I'm working in Berlin, in Germany. So some of the colleagues that I have who are German, when they speak, it sounds very natural, very fluid, but sometimes when they write messages, you can see that they put the words in different orders. Now, in this case, that is not an impediment, but there might be cases where it is. So you might have cases of people who cannot adjust the grammar so easily when they're speaking, and then you have different people with speaking the same language, but each of them is using a different structure, which might make the communication a bit more difficult. So what is it that you as a leader can do about this? A couple of things. First, you can obviously train your people and support them in trying to understand the structure that the other person is using, and also support them in developing their English skills. So you have two options there in terms of developing others. So that's what you might do with your team. Now, for you as a leader, it is also important that you yourself have the understanding that different people are using different structures, and that you understand what they're trying to convey, even if they use a different structure. As a small anecdote that illustrates this perfectly, years ago I was working in India, in the north of India, and I was working there for a few months as a primary school teacher. And there was a teacher also from another European country who visited the school. And we had this situation where she was there and I was there, and then we had someone from that small town in India, and we were all speaking English, but because the structure was so different, that teacher, that European teacher who was speaking very proper English with all of the grammar, which was also not her native language, she could not understand what the Indian person was saying because they were using English with an Indian structure. So the structure was so different that I found myself in a position where I was translating what the teacher was saying to the Indian person and what the Indian person was saying to the teacher, even though we were all speaking the same language. So as a leader, you might need to develop yourself this ability to understand the construction and the grammar that people are using. If you like languages, I think that's quite interesting. For example, I learned Arabic just for 6 months, so I cannot speak it properly at all. But that was enough for me to understand that their grammar is very, I would say dry, even though I'm not sure if that's the right word, in the meaning that they use specific words and they don't have the small words that we might have in English, which are more connectors. So they just speak the main words. So for example, they wouldn't necessarily say, my name is Carolina. They would say, I, Carolina. So those are the two items that you connect in your mind, and maybe this structure can translate into the grammar. So I'm giving the example of Arabic because for me personally, that was one of the languages with the most distinct grammar that I've studied, but maybe you have other examples as well. Now, if you as a leader have the understanding that people might be using different grammars even though they are using the same language, that might be an important insight, because then you can act as a facilitator as well. It doesn't mean that you have to be in the situation that I was with translating what one person is saying to the other, but maybe you can act as a mediator if you have that understanding. And if you cannot see it, then you can also not support other people to see it as well. So that would be the one point to work on as a leader, would be to maybe learn a little bit of a different language if you haven't already, and try to see, okay, there are some differences here, so maybe at least you have empathy for people who might come and try to speak English using their own grammar. At least you might have the empathy for it. You don't have to learn all the languages in the world, but having that experience allows you to empathize and to understand what the key issue is. The second topic in terms of language in multicultural teams that I want to kind of raise awareness for is gendered words. So for example, you might have people who are speaking English and they say the client or the customer. In general, they might be having this conversation and they say the customer, and then they use a pronoun, whether he or she, and they use it regularly. This is quite important to understand. There are languages where all the words have a gender. So Portuguese would be one of them, French the same, German the same. So it might be that people who have these backgrounds, they are not necessarily trying to, they don't have the intention to default on the male, but in English, since we have another language that has a gender for each word, it might be that we default to what is the gender in our native language, because maybe for us it doesn't make sense to say it doesn't make sense to say the customer, it wanted something. Maybe it makes sense to use a pronoun and we default to our native language one. So this might be something important, especially if you are a native English person and if you are working with people from other countries, because and this is a sensitive topic, the gender, the use of different pronouns, that is a sensitive topic. So it's good for you to have the awareness that some people might just be using the default gender on their own language, but in English. And it's good for you to kind of explore this and to have this understanding, so that you can also mediate these conversations about gender with more information. And third and final topic on this concept, or on this topic of language within multicultural teams, is a topic that is not just for multicultural teams, it's for any team in terms of language, something that you need to be aware of in any team, but more even so with multicultural teams. And that is that words themselves, the words, are symbols to represent ideas, concepts, or feelings. Why is this mindset really important? Because the same word in our common language, which might be English in these examples that I'm using, the same word, when we translate it into our native languages, might represent slightly different feelings or ideas or concepts. And what is the consequence of this in your teamwork? You might have people who all agree on the right English words, and they all say, yes, we're talking about the same thing. But in reality, the concept, the idea, or the feeling that that word represents for them is slightly different. Now, this already happens in people who are just different people, even if they come from the same culture, because we all as individuals might have slightly different interpretations of certain concepts. But it's even more prominent, or it might become even more prominent, if you have people from different cultures, because their historical background, their cultural background might actually have very different associations to different words. You might have a word that is neutral in English, and maybe it's super positive in a different culture and super negative on a third culture. So you might be using the same words, and yet each person is going to interpret it very differently because of their cultural context. So this is also interesting to see, especially in countries that are very different. So for example, I'm from Portugal, which is West Europe. Maybe there are some words that I would use with people who are from Eastern Europe or from Asia or from South America that would have different connotations. And that is important to have as an awareness, both for all of your team members, but also for you as a leader, so that you make sure that when you are facilitating conversations with the whole team, you keep this in mind, and when you come to an agreement that yes, we're using this word in English and we are all understanding the same, maybe in some situations it's worth it to explore a bit more, to ask a bit of clarifying questions, and to really understand if culturally that word is represented equally, or not represented equally, but if it has exactly the same meaning for people who come from different cultures. So this is it on the topic of language, and in specific English language in multicultural teams that come from completely different cultures and completely different backgrounds. I do hope that this was helpful for you, and that now you're a bit more aware of some things to pay attention to when you have multicultural teams. If you want to develop your leadership skills, I'm going to leave some links down below to the online course that I host. If you are interested and if it makes sense for you, then I will leave the link there for you to check it out. Either way, I do hope that this was helpful, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. Bye.